Good afternoon. We're here for another episode of Innovations in Education for a Big, Bold Future. And today we have a special episode dealing with the American Rescue Plan, which is dollars coming into the state to help with recovery from COVID, education recovery, and building a new foundation for education, which will help us come out of the pandemic even stronger than before we went into the pandemic. With me today, I have Commissioner Jason Glass from the Kentucky Department of Education to talk to us about the details of the rescue plan and how those dollars can be used in the state and how community members, parents, and other leaders in communities can be part of the planning to ensure our students are able to recover from COVID from an education standpoint and accelerate their learning in the years to come. Commissioner Glass, thank you for joining us for this special episode. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Bridget. It's wonderful to be here with you.
So if you want to just share with me to begin with, just kind of your overall thoughts on the impact of COVID on education and what these rescue dollars could mean for recovery.
Sure. Well, of course, COVID over this past year has been incredibly disruptive to education from going back to when we had to close down schools in the 1920 school year at the end. Fortunately, at that point, we had a whole year of relationships built as we were able to then transition to those remote learning environments and finish out that school year. But then we had to restart the school year with all sorts of different models of education delivery that ranged from full in-person with several different virus mitigation techniques being used to full virtual or remote options and everything in between, all sorts of hybrid models. And so we don't really know how effective or ineffective those different delivery models were.
And our schools and districts, teachers were doing everything they could to stay in contact with students and families.
Oh, it was an incredible
and deliver
lift.
Learning in ways they'd never even imagined.
Yeah, it was an incredible undertaking just to think through all of the things that, education is a congregational activity. You come together in groups and learn. And that's exactly how this virus spread. So that was the source of the disruption. So all the thinking about how we did everything related to education had to be turned on its head and re-examined and thought through. And then over the course of this past year, all of the efforts to keep learning going in some ways, we had disruptions with quarantines and starts and stops as the virus numbers grew exponentially and then seemed to get under control, to now where we're emerging from it and vaccinations are widespread and available.
Hence the two of us able to be here in the studio today.
Right.
And Commissioner Glass and I are meeting for the first time in person. We've met, of course, on screen, but never in person. So it is really a treat, and a treat made possible by those vaccinations.
Right. And so I would encourage everybody to get vaccinated. And we see the exponential decline of the virus now because of that. And so it's making the vaccinations and the drop in the positivity rates really just make the world a safer place to be. So that's exciting. Some of the things that happened, even in spite of those disruptions, I think will be positive elements that will continue forward. So we saw an expansion in personalized and asymmetric learning opportunities. We saw what was capable with students using technology along with instruction and access to content information. We saw different approaches of teachers having students do work and learn in communities. I think those things are going to stick.
Those community hubs, like in Jefferson County.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which was, I think, a response early in the pandemic where we saw parents with means able to create learning hubs at home. And Jefferson County is a great example of figuring out a community-based approach that serves students regardless of family means. In a community-based learning environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are going to be several things that we will be glad to let go of out of this pandemic experience, but there are also going to be some things that we'll want to hang on to and amplify because for example, one shift that we've seen is a demand for these sort of hybrid, out-of-school or even fully remote learning experiences for students. Some of our students really thrived in that environment and appreciated the flexibility that came with it, and they're now demanding that of their school systems, and our school systems are responding to that. We had 102 districts in the state that requested flexibility on offering those diverse learning options going forward, and I think that's a good thing. The more that we can customize customize education options to what families and students need, the better off we're going to be. So I think this is one of those things that we're going to carry forward.
And the focus on those bright spots, those innovations that actually make learning better, is exactly where our creative capacity should be as we move forward. So we are, in fact, making education better as we move forward relative to before we went into the pandemic.
Right.
Yep. So just for our listeners, as a reminder, we kicked this series off on March 16th or 17th of last year, right as everyone was starting to get settled at home. And at the time, Commissioner Glass, interim Commissioner Kevin Brown was our guest, and President Aaron Thompson of the Council on Post-Secondary Education. And we knew we had no answers then. We knew our leaders had very few answers. But these conversations are in part to alleviate that uncertainty and to lift up the bright spots that you're seeing and that others are seeing that give all the rest of us hope. So thank you for sharing some of those, like personalized learning, which I think there's been a demand for some time. But COVID clearly pushed us in that direction with some urgency,
right,
relative to before the pandemic. And so we want to hold on to that for sure.
Absolutely. And I think even though we saw the limitations of what technology could do, we also saw really an expansion in what's capable with it. And we just broke through that barrier of the question of, are we going to have one device per student or not? Are we going to have that kind of configuration in place? And now that's largely in place all across the state of Kentucky. So I think that's another positive breakthrough as well. I imagine at some point in every Kentucky community, some superintendent and school board said, we are just having hot and cold running water in the buildings. It's just time. And COVID created that opportunity for the one-to-one device efforts across the state.
Yes, exactly.
It was just time for us to make that leap.
Yes, for universal broadband, for remote work, remote learning, and remote access to healthcare. And we're so grateful that the General Assembly and the governor put money in the budget to expand broadband, another area where urgency has been created, and we need to stay the course.
Right. We saw a lot of, the inequities that were present before the pandemic were exacerbated during it. And so we still don't know the full impact of that, but we expect some of our families struggled more without the supports that they get in an in-person setting. And I know that our schools and educators were struggling to provide those in any way that they could. But I think that's one of the questions still hanging out there, is when we return to a post-COVID, post-pandemic school environment, what inequities are we going to see? And then over the next several years, how are we going to work to mitigate those, which is why the American Rescue Plan funds are so important.
So let's talk about the Rescue Plan dollars. $2.1 billion coming into the state directly to our school districts for recovery and for building that new foundation over a 3-year period of time. So supporting education in school years 22, 23, and 24. So Commissioner, $2.1 billion, that's a lot of money for us.
Unprecedented. We're likely to never see this kind of funds available for education in our lifetimes again.
So share with us the guidance you're sharing with superintendents and district leaders about how to leverage those dollars and use them most effectively, recognizing the uneven learning outcomes we likely have, the exacerbation of inequities through the COVID year. What direction are you giving that parents and community members could benefit from hearing?
Well, it's important to put the American Rescue Plan funds in the context of all of the federal money that's come in, because this is really the third wave of relief or rescue funding that we've received. The first wave, the CRRSA funds, were smaller. They were very focused on virus mitigation, masks, hand sanitizers, temperature screeners, things that were designed to support schools in getting open and continuing to deliver services. That was a much smaller pool of money.
The base of the hierarchy, right? Health and safety.
Right. Let's start with that. And then the second wave of funding that came this past spring, around January, was around over $1 billion for Kentucky. Uses the Title I distribution model, so looks at poverty in communities and distributes the funds to school districts based on that. That was focused on virus mitigation, continuation of that, other impacts that schools had to their budgets. For example, the food service budgets were decimated because a lot of the school districts stopped charging for lunches, and most school districts' food service budgets are built on some fee collection for lunch programs. Transportation programs were decimated in funding. So it was an opportunity to sort of stabilize those. And then we saw in Kentucky, and we incentivized from the department, districts thinking about how they could use those funds to create strategies to mitigate learning loss and create experiences for students who had missed out on so much over this past year. And so thinking about summer school programming, identification of areas where students had fallen behind, how they may create meaningful experiences, not just in the summer, but coming back next year and beyond. So that was that second wave. So now we're to the third wave, which is an even bigger. It's almost double what the second wave was. So it's an unprecedented infusion of dollars into schools in Kentucky. It can be used for similar purposes as the first two. We're still awaiting final guidance from the U.S. Department of Education on what exactly that looks like. But some things around changes to buildings that will make them more able to filter out viruses in the future. Ventilation changes, that's part of it.
Health and safety, resiliency.
Health and safety, yeah, absolutely. Some things like that. But we also see more earmarks in this third batch of funds where they're intended for learning loss mitigation, systems to identify where students are, sort of formative assessment tools, services and supports for students, again, in those summer schools, expanded day, extended day, extended year, weekend programs, partnerships with local community organizations. There really is a plethora, a variety of different ways schools could use those funds over the next 3 years, all aimed toward catching kids up for what they missed out on this past year academically. But also, I think, and how I would phrase it is, you have an opportunity to create what has been a year of awful into 3 years of really awesome, because we're going to be able to do some amazing things, create some wonderful experiences for kids that we never would have been able to without these funds.
And drawing from what we learned through COVID, as you described, that technology enhancements work for some students, more personalized learning is beneficial for most, if not all, students.
And it's going to strengthen the community partnerships because the school districts are not going to be able to expend all these funds with the staff and the capacity that they have. So they're going to have to look at nonprofits, faith-based organizations, other community organizations, other governments that are there locally, and it will strengthen, I think, the relationships that they have, because they're all going to have an interest in serving the kids that are in their community.
Yes.
So I think we're going to see wonderful programs emerge that I hope will have some permanence beyond the pandemic. Even after these funds run out, we may see programs, after school, tutoring, sports activities, programs that are created for students that communities go, we really value this. This is really great for our kids. Let's find a way to continue this. I hope that we see some of that as well.
And I was going to ask you, how important are community-based organizations as part of this conversation? Clearly very important.
In the planning stage and in the continued delivery stage.
Absolutely.
So I think in communities where you already have these strong community partnerships, they have a bit of a head start on planning and what this might look like. But for those that don't, or it's not as strong, it's an opportunity for a school district to reach out to its public library system and say, how could we do something to create a summer reading program and deliver books to kids in schools, or a faith-based food insecurity program? How can we work with our transportation system that the district has to deliver meals to communities, parts of communities. So there are endless opportunities for creativity in how school districts and community partners work together.
Are you seeing specific bright spots in the state where you see this type of conversation happening between the school district and community partners that you would point to as a great example?
I've been really impressed with several of our districts here in Kentucky. We featured several of them on a superintendent webcast that we had. They included Warren County and the outreach that they were doing, the plan for learning loss mitigation and supports going forward. Pikeville Independent, really really impressed with the work that's happening in Rockcastle County and the well thought through comprehensive support program that they've put in place. We had Fayette County and the interim superintendent there come on and talk about their Summer Ignite program that's going to create great opportunities for their students. With the third round of the American Rescue Plan funds, it requires engagement with stakeholders in the community as part of the planning process for what those funds will do and how they will be used. So districts are just at the beginning of that. I mentioned earlier we're working with and awaiting clear guidance from the U.S. Department of Education on what exactly that means. We're under an incredible time frame because there's all this pressure to start spending the money, come up with the plans, and at the same time we haven't seen the final guidance on this. So I know that it feels disconnected and there's a lot of pressure on our school organizations to sort of figure this out and get to work. But I think even in spite of that, we're going to see some wonderful partnerships, some community developed partnerships emerge.
That's great. So with respect to the requirement of stakeholder engagement, what guidance or direction are you giving to superintendents now as to how they might best go about that?
Well, really, it's been from an advisory standpoint. So we haven't issued any formal guidance on here's exactly how you have to do that. The language does talk about meaningful stakeholder engagement. And so what that doesn't look like is a superintendent deciding unilaterally how the funds are going to be spent. How that best can happen is the involvement of the Board of Education in that decision-making process, as the Board of Education represents the voices of the community. Special meetings and outreach through the district's website, communication channels, local media, radio, newspapers around their plans and inviting feedback in a variety of ways. Those could be town hall meetings. They could be inviting and expanding school boards. They could be written submissions that come in on electronic comments. There's a variety of different ways school districts could do that.
And maybe even getting out into the community.
Absolutely.
Visiting
especially
a church or
most underserved communities, historically underserved communities. So that would be my advice, is involve the school board. Think of all the ways that you can communicate and gather information. Work with community organizations that serve your most historically underserved communities, so that you're targeting and thinking about how can I radically include those voices and groups that have not had a voice at the table.
I love that phrase, radically include,
radically
right?
And then also think about how schools can be involved in the staff that's at schools, the parents that are at schools, our site-based decision-making councils, classified support personnel, and reserve a significant amount of those funds to be allocated and distributed at the school level. So it's really, I think, going to take a full court press where you have the district establishing and developing relationships with other governments, other large-scale community organizations, all the way down to custodians, food service workers, teachers, parents in schools, thinking about bus drivers within our school community. What can we do? What can we put in place? So they're going to be sort of macro level down to very micro level innovations and supports that schools will put in place.
If I'm a parent leader in a community in Kentucky, I'm a business leader, I'm a community leader, how do you advise me to get involved?
I would contact my local school district and make them aware of your interest and ask about what programs or ways are planned for how the community will be engaged. Our school districts should be coming up with those right now, so it's a great time to do that and make yourself known. I can imagine school districts that would be creating community steering committees and would be asking for involvement on those. So that's a good way to be involved. But
guiding coalitions.
Guiding coalitions.
We do have 3 years, right? I mean, there's this
and
money.
Things are going to change over time.
Things will change.
What we think right now.
And we want to go from learning loss. We want to go from learning loss to accelerating learning, right?
Absolutely,
over that arc
and
of
accelerating
time.
experiences. So initially, there's this focus on stabilization. Then there was a focus on mitigating what we've lost. But I think we're going to move through that fairly quickly and then think about what value we can add. And we're going to have 3 years of these unprecedented funds to do that. So and I think that there will be shifts to this over these period of 3 years, where districts are going to get a year and a half down the road, and they're going to think of something else innovative that they could do with these funds. And so they'll need to be considering how they can shift and adapt along the course of this.
So, Commissioner, a variety of groups have issued guiding questions for districts, community leaders to consider as they're making these plans. Do you have some top-tier questions that you feel all districts should be asking, all communities should be asking as they're putting these plans together?
Sure. I think I would first be asking what are the needs of my most vulnerable students, and what am I doing to support those students and those families? I would be considering, or another guiding question would be, how will I quantify and know the learning loss and the fundamentals that has occurred this year, and what's my plan for recovering from that? I would be asking how I can bring joy into my students and my families.
A love of learning.
A love of learning. How can I create experiences for them so that we're considering that whole child perspective? I would be thinking about who can I partner with in the community, all of those entities and organizations that we talked about. I would be thinking about how I could go from macro to micro. What are the big system? What can we do as a whole district or community? Down to what can one individual teacher or one bus driver, how can I create opportunities for everyone to be engaged and to be involved? And I would be considering how am I, again, going back to that term, radically involving, radically including those voices who historically are not, and what steps do we need to make to ensure that they are?
Yeah, if that means getting out to the barber shop or the playground or the swimming pool, whatever it might mean.
It's going to be different with every group and in every community, but I think that if we rely on our district leaders, our school boards, and the people who work in our schools, who are in all levels, they have tremendous connections and relationships in communities, and so there really is enough funding here to think about how you could spread that throughout a community, throughout an organization, involve everybody, and do some really amazing things for kids.
Are there specific strategies for recovery from learning loss and acceleration that are top of mind for you that you might suggest districts consider?
Well, I think one of the places to start is to, from that fundamentals content perspective, how far behind are students? We know from the experience with Hurricane Katrina as one example of where a school system was absolutely decimated and shut down for 6 months to a year in some cases, that it took several years for students to recover from that experience where they had very little, even less support from a remote learning perspective than our students have. We don't really know right now the extent of that. Our schools have formative data. They'll be able to evaluate when students come back, and they have data now that will give them some indication of that. We'll look for the education research community to help quantify what that loss looked like. I expect studies will be coming out on that will give us a good barometer indicator. We have our state assessment data, but we have selection bias in that because some students were present to take the test, others weren't. So there will be problems with that data. But all of that together, I think will give school districts a pretty good idea of where students are. And then the most powerful thing will be educators working directly with students, standing at the shoulder, seeing where their gaps in learning are. So then we can use these rescue plan funds for those summer school experiences, for supports after school, in Saturday schools, extended day programs, things like that in school. So I think we're going to see a lot of focus on that, especially in this first 6 months as we come back. But I would caution that we don't want to overemphasize sort of a foundational fundamentals approach to education. We know that our students missed out on a lot, but they not only missed out on academic learning, we have social emotional issues that we will be contending with. We have relationships that we need to rebuild. There's just a lot of isolation and experiences that were lost out. We really have to think of this long term. We've got 3 years to use these funds. How can we thoughtfully create experiences over the course of that 3 years where all of our students' needs are attended to? How can we catalog, not just from a learning loss perspective, but from an experience gained perspective, what value can we add for kids over these next several years?
So you touched on my last question for you, and that is about our students' mental health. Over the last year, the Pritchard Committee's done a series of surveying of families, of teachers, of students at the K-12 level, the post-secondary level, and even in the early childhood space. In the K-12 space, it came out loud and clear, as well as the college space. Mental health is a big issue for our students, for our families, for our teachers. What do you say now as our teachers are entering the summer months? They're thinking about teacher well-being, put your oxygen mask on before you help others. We need to think about teacher well-being. We need to think about student mental health. How do we do that? Educators are not mental health experts. Those in education are not mental health experts. How best do we respond to that clear takeaway through COVID that mental health was an issue?
I think that's one of the things that we experienced over the pandemic that we need to think about. How can we amplify going forward? That is a focus on mental health and social emotional needs. There were so many times that when everyone was disconnected, we stopped and intentionally asked, how are you doing? Or reached out to people and say, how are you doing? Especially students that we could see falling away, they were becoming disengaged. There was this intentional effort to make sure that we caught that person and followed up. So that's something I think we need to continue going forward. It's one of those learnings from the pandemic that we didn't stop and ask how people were doing. We didn't have intentional social emotional check-ins like we did during the pandemic. So I want to see that continue. I would like to see that continue. I think that a school district can consider a program like social emotional first aid for everybody, that there are some things that everyone knows how to do. These check-ins, wellness, social emotional wellness, seeing how students are doing, that everyone can participate in and knows how to do. Then there are more intensive approaches where you can identify a student or a family that's really struggling that needs to be supported in a different way, and then very targeted approaches where you know someone is at risk. Maybe they're thinking about harming themselves. Maybe you have chronic absenteeism or chronic disengagement of some form, and something significant needs to happen. So I think school districts can approach it that way, but I think the biggest shift will be that first aid, social emotional first aid for everybody, where everybody sees themselves as able to step in and help.
A tiered approach, and that first approach, the social emotional first aid, look for the helpers, and we can all be helpers.
Right, absolutely. I've seen great examples of this in communities that have they suffer from suicidal ideation, which sometimes spreads like a virus in communities. Once you have one student that either attempts or succeeds, other students start thinking of that as a solution. And they come forward with these efforts to train everybody in suicide prevention first aid. And I think that same concept can be extended to social emotional well-being and mental health. How can everybody know how to begin those conversations with students and families and support all students toward that?
A great takeaway for our post-secondary community, and I think our college students too, who can learn to be those helpers.
Yeah, we heard from our students that one of their main priorities going forward, that they want to make sure that adults heard that they appreciated that, and they want that to be part of their educational experience going forward. So we interviewed numerous students and student groups, and they were very clear about that. This is a priority for them. Don't let this go for us. So that, I think as professionals, that's something that we have to take to heart and then make a reality for our students going forward.
Absolutely, involving them. Yes, absolutely. Well, Commissioner Glass, this has truly been a pleasure, and it is, I think, a really exciting time. We're coming out of a difficult environment, no doubt, with COVID, but to focus on the opportunities, to focus on the positive learning, the things that we have an opportunity to do more of, and the building that we have an opportunity to do makes this a very exciting time.
Well, thank you.
Your positive, solutions-focused orientation is at the helm, and we very much appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Bridget, and thank you to you and to the Pritchard Committee. You're a tremendous and tireless advocate for public education and supporting equity and making sure that all kids get what they need. So we're grateful for your support as well.